What is up, everybody? Nateinthewild here. Thank you so much for joining me. Hey, I want to talk a little bit about astrophotography. I know that we just entered February, which is like the absolute dead of winter for everybody in the Northern Hemisphere. Raise your hand if you're ready for some sunshine. But that does mean that spring is around the corner, and spring signals the start of Milky Way season. And I think it's kind of a logical progression for landscape photographers, right? You go out, you take photos of sunsets, they're beautiful, you're up on a mountaintop, you go in when it gets dark. Well, eventually you're going to start getting curious about what comes next, right? Like after the sunset, does all the fun have to stop when it gets dark? Obviously not. Cameras nowadays are so good in low light. There's all these incredible lenses that people didn't even dream of having 10, 15 years ago. And with the help of my friends at B&H Photo, I was lucky enough to take 3 of the absolute best lenses there are for astrophotography out for a beautiful night of photography in Mount Rainier National Park. Conditions were perfect, and they were absolutely amazing lenses. So I'm going to run you down through some of the pros and cons. So the 3 lenses I took out, I had the Voigtlander 21mm f1.4. It's a pretty unique focal length there. The Tokina 20mm f2.0, and of course the heavyweight champion of this arena, the Sony 24mm f1.4. Now, I don't say heavyweight champion because it's the heaviest lens. It's actually, I think, by far the lightest lens of the 3, but it has the preeminent reputation in this category. It's famously incredible. So it was fun to see how a couple other lenses would stack up against that. For the purposes of keeping everything even, I used the exact same camera on the same tripod. I didn't use side-by-side cameras. It was a Sony a7R III. I have an a7 III also, and I know that that's maybe a little bit better for low light sensitivity. It's got larger pixels, etc. But I wanted to be able to pixel peep these photos, and I felt that dealing with a little bit of extra noise in the photo was probably a good trade-off for the ability to really zoom in a little bit extra with that 42 megapixels versus 24 megapixels. You can see the conditions were pretty good. Things were fun. Let's get into it. Let's get nerdy. Okay, so first things first, what I like about lenses, I guess. Let's just talk a little bit about personal preferences. So fast aperture, super important, right? The lower that f-stop, the wider your aperture, the more light can get in. This allows you to do shorter shutter speeds, which means less streaking in the stars, lower ISOs, which means a cleaner overall image, less noise. Of course, there's ways around that. If you want to stack a bunch of multiple exposures, etc., you can reduce noise. But just for a single shot, I love a fast aperture. It's the easiest way to increase your astrophotography game. So right off the bat, there's 2 front runners there, right? The Sony 24mm f1.4 and then the Voigtlander, which is a 21 f1.4. I've found myself wondering a little bit if 24 millimeters is wide enough for me for astrophotography. And of course, this is situationally dependent, right? There's going to be scenarios where 24 millimeters is too wide, and there's going to be situations where 24 millimeters isn't wide enough. I find myself liking the 16 to 20 millimeter range for astrophotography as just a general rule. That's not to say that 24 is prohibitive, but I kind of went into this anticipating the Voigtlander winning me over. When they arrived, the Voigtlander weighed about as much as my Subaru. I was a little bit shocked pulling it out of the box. I felt like I was at the gym. I mean, it's German engineering, right? It's beautifully crafted, but it's built like a Rolls Royce. It feels like you could stack a couple of them up as a foundation for a house and it would be there 500 years later. Once again, beautifully made, a little bit heavy. I do a lot of backpacking, backcountry style photography. I'm not the kind of person to park in a parking lot and take photos from my driver's seat using a remote shutter. Well, it does sound kind of nice. Maybe I should think about it. Anyhow, this has to go in my backpack. I have to carry it, and I don't like to blow my legs out just on the way to the shoot, because that's only the halfway point, right? You still have to do the work and then hike all the way back to the car to get home. So that was kind of a negative. The Tokina is 20 millimeters, f2.0, also pretty heavy. I guess at a certain point, if you're there to do the job, you're there to do the job, though, right? So I can't complain about the weight too much. I'm already carrying 2 bodies, 2 tripods, and 4 lenses with me for this project, so it's not like it's going to be an easy hike regardless. The Tokina feels nice. I love the raised ring for focusing an aperture. It's full manual. And, the f2.0 isn't as fast as f1.4, obviously, but I love the focal length. 20 millimeters is absolutely spot on, in my opinion. And, f2.0 is still fast enough for me. I'm still able to make it work. Okay, so getting down into the nitty-gritty. This is a photo taken with the Voigtlander 21mm. You can see right off the bat, just so that we're all on the same page here, I did some brief adjustments on these photos. I just raised the exposure a little bit. I added a little bit of contrast, some clarity, and a little bit of vibrance. Just taking the raw photos, making them less raw. Nothing extreme. There's no presets or anything applied here. I wanted them to be fairly natural, but of course, as you can see, a truly raw photo out of a camera is never the perfect way to analyze anything. They're always flat. They're always pretty neutral looking. So I wanted to at least give a little light into them. That said, I did copy and paste these settings exactly between all 3 lenses, so the adjustments are identical and shouldn't have an impact on the overall results of this analysis. So it goes without saying that you don't want a ton of vignette in an astrophoto. There's certainly no way around it. You're going to have some, especially with a hyper-fast lens like f1.4 aperture. That said, I found the Voigtlander to have such an astonishing vignette that it's almost impossible to overcome. The corners drop off into like pitch black while the center is beautifully exposed. And compensating for that means that if your corners are properly exposed, the center of the frame is completely blown out. This is something that I haven't been able to find a good solution to. I think just realistically, the Voigtlander has a lot of vignette, and you have to make the choice if this is artistically something that you like in your photos. There are Lightroom lens adjustments that you can make. They have these built-in lens profiles, and while it does benefit the lens to a certain extent in this case, I found it to be overkill, and it actually raises the exposure so much because you have this dramatic like 1.5 stop, 2-stop exposure variance between the center of the frame and the corners that when you're compensating for that, you end up with just a ridiculous amount of color noise in the corners. I think you're kind of just stuck with it unless you have some really fancy software and a lot of time for editing. I don't actually hate it, artistically speaking. I just wish it was a choice I could make, artistically speaking, rather than being forced into it with every photo. The Voigtlander also suffered from extreme coma. The center of the frame, if we zoom in on this, I had trouble telling if it was focused or not. I probably took 30 photos, and you look at the smaller stars here, and they're sharp, and the bigger stars look like little comet tails. And that's even in the center of the frame. When you move towards the corners, you start to get these shots where they look like little Saturns there, right? They look ridiculous. So the Voigtlander, despite being what I thought was going to be the front runner for this, after some analysis, after I really started running through it, I was kind of shocked to find that the quality didn't hold up to what I was expecting, especially for the price of a lens like this. So moving on to the Tokina 20mm. Once again, kind of a strong vignette on it. Less so, though. It's a gradual drop-off, which to me is a little bit more appealing. Instead of this sharp, dramatic, like nearly instant drop into blackness in the corners, you get this really smooth, honestly pretty appealing vignette towards the edges. I don't dislike it. Once again, the Lightroom autocorrections I found a little bit extreme. The corners down here have a ton of noise when you try to raise the exposure to be even across the frame. And I don't know if that's something that I'm going to find super appealing in the long term. As far as chroma goes, it's low and manageable in the middle. It's actually a pretty nice looking lens towards the center of the frame. There is a little bit of that chromatic aberration. You can see these stars look sort of magenta, and just in case anyone thinks those are my adjustments making it look that way, you can see that the unedited photo also features magenta stars. That's straight out of camera, which means that it is an artifact of the lens itself. As we move towards the corner, though, this chroma gets a little bit more extreme, you can see. It's not bad. It's almost kind of artistic in a way. It's not as extreme as the Voigtlander. It sort of gives it this cool tubular shape, like it's almost a barrel distortion more than a chroma. But that said, if we're talking about spending 4 figures on a lens, we want as close to technically perfect as we're able to get. Last but not least, let's talk about this Sony 24mm f1.4. So, full disclosure, I am sponsored by Sony. I'm a member of the Alpha Imaging Collective. That said, they did not pay me to endorse this lens. I actually went into this review hoping it wouldn't be my favorite, just so the people would see I'm not a giant fanboy. I mean, I am a giant fanboy, but I was trying my best to be unbiased. All said and done, it blew the socks off the competition, and there's just kind of no way around it. It weighs significantly less, so if I wasn't carrying a ridiculous amount of gear for a project like this, I would find myself still grabbing this one before the other two just for a weight savings purpose. But it's also just the sharpest lens all around, even at f1.4. You'll see in the middle of the frame here, these stars are a single pixel wide. It focused down to the point where everything is as tack sharp as you could ever hope. There is still a fairly significant amount of that chromatic aberration. You're getting these magenta stars again. It is what it is. It's an easy fix in editing. You can select that channel and reduce the saturation and get rid of all of those. It's not a deal breaker for any of these 3 lenses. Zero chroma in the center of the frame, which is extremely important to me. But I do find a tiny bit again in the corners. But if you look, these are lacking that Saturn look where they have like the wings on the edge of the stars. They're just a little bit stretched. This is a rectilinear lens, of course. I mean, 24mm isn't quite wide enough to need the term rectilinear, but they do have a little bit of that projection correction, so there's no bowing to any of your straight lines, and that causes the stars to be a little stretched. For me, that's super forgivable, and it's significantly easier for me to accept that than true chroma, where all of your stars are just actually visibly refracted incorrectly. The vignette on this is beautiful. It's gently feathered towards the edges. The edges are not blaringly dark, and although I still don't love the profile correction saved in Lightroom, I think it's a little bit extreme. When you zoom into these corners, you can see that although there's an additional amount of noise from raising that exposure, it's manageable. It's not nearly as dramatic as with the other 2 lenses. This is actually still a usable photo, even with the profile correction. And so in this case, to me, that's major points, right? The vignette is an artistic choice. It's an intentional choice. It's not mandatory. You aren't required to have a vignette like you are, especially with the Voigtlander, where you're like, you can't correct it. That's your photo. I don't love that. So once again, the Sony wins handily for me in that regard. Now, the biggest downside for this lens, and I will have to admit that this is a downside for me personally, just like a personal shortcoming, I found it really difficult to focus. Not because it doesn't focus, but rather because it is such a thin field of view at f1.4 that you have to really fine-tune that ring as you're turning it, right? And the Voigtlander, I found, had a lot of travel on that focus ring, which made it a little bit easier to focus. The Sony focus ring is fast, which could be really, really cool if you're manually racking focus on a video project. There's a lot of good advantages to it. But for Astro, I found it kind of tough. I found myself struggling to dial this in, taking kind of an obnoxious amount of test shots and then pixel peeping afterwards, chimping my viewfinder to make sure everything was focused. It's okay. It's not the end of the world, but it is something to think about. Perhaps it's something they can adjust in a firmware update in the future if there's enough feedback for something like this. But as far as negatives go, I think that's pretty small. So that's about it for me, folks. Thank you so much for listening. I'm sure you can tell by my 200 subscribers I don't do a whole lot of this YouTube stuff, but it's part of my New Year's resolution to get back into it a little bit more. So please help me out. Click that subscribe button. You can find me all over the internet as Nateinthewild. Drop a comment below. Let me know what you think. Have you tried any of these lenses? I would love to get some third-party feedback. And I hope to hear from you all soon. Thanks so much.